really, really looking forward to this conversation because we're going to actually be talking about climate debt and climate justice because report was recently published, and we're going to be amplifying that report while also talking to Maizah Ali, who is part of that report and is also an artist. So let me actually talk a little bit about who Maizah Ali is. She is an illustrator, community artist, aspiring scholar who graduated from UCLA with degrees in international development studies and cognitive science. Currently, she works as a teaching artist with Stay Arts, an arts education nonprofit organization serving the Southeast LA community. She will continue her academic studies at LSE in the fall, where she plans to research the intersections of geopolitics, critical technology studies, and multimedia storytelling. So I am happy to say we have an artist here today. And actually, you have two artists because I'm also an artist as well. So we're going to spend a little bit of time also talking about the connection between artistry and movement and how they're inextricably connected in a lot of ways. Um, and one of the things that I think is so cool about Maizah Ali is she is a teaching artist as well. And you'll see some of her pieces in the climate debt to climate justice report. So welcome, Maizah. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
Of course. So I want to actually add a little bit of context here because oftentimes when I'm talking to you all, we're talking really obviously about our for-profit driven housing system or our for-profit driven education system, etc. But today we're going to be talking about how climate debt is connected to our climate justice movement and how we need to be talking more in collaboration and solidarity. So the global north has contributed disproportionately to the climate crisis in general. And while many countries in the global south are bearing the heaviest consequences, it's important to center an international solidarity movement if we really want to have a real impact in confronting the climate catastrophe. And there's actually next Friday, June 5th, is a really important day. It's actually known as I believe it's called International Climate Day. And it's really the point of it is to have an international approach and to center the most marginalized communities when it comes to the climate justice movement. And so that's part of the reason that we're going to be actually sharing some of Maizah Ali's art, some of the report in the ensuing days. So look out for that. The report itself the full title is From Debt to Climate Justice, Organizing for the Fight for Climate Repair. The report was written by Hannah Appel, Eric Hazard, Andrew Ross, Matt Schneider, and Maizah Ali was also involved through UCLA's Luskin Institute on Inequality and Democracy. This is not just an academic report, y'all. It's actually a teaching tool, I would say. Would you agree, Maizah? Yeah, it's definitely a teaching tool. It gives people a free framework for understanding how to build an international movement for climate justice. I think when we hear the term debt, people automatically think about money, but I'm sure, Maizah, you probably experienced this too while working on the report, that you start to become kind of obsessed with debt and that it's actually deeply psychological and political um, because debt really functions in our society, especially unjust debt, as a form of social control, and debt becomes like this discipline. And I think that's especially true when it comes to climate change. For example, countries across the Caribbean, Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America, many of these countries were already shaped by colonial extraction, and they're burdened by IMF debt and austerity. But now they're being forced to absorb the devastating cost of climate disaster on top of everything else. I've shared in other posts that my father's from Jamaica and actually have dual citizenship. And I was personally really just in a lot of fear because there was a devastating hurricane that hit Jamaica. There are hurricanes and other floods that happened in the Philippines. So a lot of countries are being impacted by the climate crisis, and entire communities are being forced to rebuild infrastructure. They have to recover from the floods and the storms. They have to deal with rising energy costs, food insecurity, displacement, and all while they're doing this simultaneously while they're being forced to meet debt obligations to wealthier countries and financial institutions. So, as I said before, and I'll stop talking and get into the interview, the countries that contributed the least to climate change are being forced to pay the highest price for it. And that is what we're going to be talking about today, among other things. So, Miza, without further ado, the first question I have for you is I want to hear a little bit more about you personally. So, can you tell us about how you first became interested in studying climate change and debt, the interconnection between the two?
Yeah, thank you for that really great introduction, super thorough. Yeah, so I guess personally, I got involved through in this report through my undergrad. So I had initially signed up for this undergraduate research opportunity called Sustainable LA Research Scholars Program while at UCLA. So kind of a long title, but I was initially kind of hesitant about being part of this research program because I feel like sustainability is usually approached from a pretty liberal angle, and it usually is considered quite disjointed from global structures of oppression like capitalism, colonialism, when in reality, all of these issues are so insanely interconnected as we see in this report, as we see every day. Yeah, I was initially hesitant because I'm more interested in the critical social sciences. And I feel like sustainability and climate is oftentimes also very individualized when it's really a collective issue. Um, and yeah, so I wanted to approach sustainability through more of a critical and interdisciplinary lens. So I'm coming from this background of international development studies, which is uh, was a really great major for me at UCLA because it allowed me to understand kind of the structural and historical reasons why we see a divide between the global north and global south. Um, it took a very critical and interdisciplinary approach, and through my major, I had previously taken a course with Professor Hannah Appel, who also worked on this report, of course, and that course approached global capitalism from an anthropological perspective, which was honestly really life-changing because it connected these, like, broader issues of capitalism and finance, and approached it from a very human perspective and a very collective and community-oriented perspective, which I think this report also does, and what you were kind of also, um hinting at earlier when you talked about how debt is, like, considered this big, obscure thing that kinda just affects us in all sorts of different ways. Um, and I also really appreciate that, Hannah bridges her scholarship always with her activism and community work. I think that those have to be intertwined. So yeah, I was eager to work with Hannah through the Sustainable LA Research Scholars Program and was able to hop on this new debt collective project, which bridges climate justice, debt, and transnational finance with an emphasis on global South perspectives and on approaching these issues through community work and organizing. And personally, I didn't initially realize just how interconnected all these topics were, because again, I think climate and environment are typically spoken about in like a very particular way, just like in a vacuum, and not always related back to like this critical anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist perspective. So it was really great to be introduced to all of these topics on a very deep and very relevant level through this project. And it was also very timely for me because at the time, which was around 2022, I think, there was this catastrophic flooding in Pakistan, which my where my parents are from. So interesting that we kind of have that connection there. And this incident catastrophe was also mentioned in the report, as well as the prime minister's response and calls for climate justice. So I think it's just a very full circle moment, just like so timely in so many different ways.
That's incredible. Can you talk a little bit more about what the prime minister's response to the flood was, and how just you were dealing with the personal experience of your family being impacted and then working on the research project. What was that like?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I can speak about it in a whole lot of depth because it was like a few years ago.
Oh,
But
yeah.
yeah, I believe the prime minister's response was like spoken about in the report, and he called for like I think one of the things was discussing like climate reparations as part of it, and it was really this direct tie between climate issues and sovereign debt was included in his response. Um, and that is spoken about in the report, as well as like many other leaders' responses to similar kinds of climate related catastrophes. Um, and yeah, I think personally, it was just very impactful seeing like how these issues were happening in the real world and just seeing how relevant they were in real time. Um, and yeah, I think that's about all I can say about that.
No, absolutely. I just really resonate with that because I think that in a lot of ways, people forget that this is really impacting real human beings, real people. And when one of the ways that I was impacted as well is like this reading the report talking about reparations, because in at Debt Collective, which by the way, Hannah Appel is also one of our co founders of Debt Collective, for those that don't know. But we talk about just versus unjust debts. And so what you're speaking to in a lot of ways is this a leader of a nation that is being devastated by this flood saying we demand reparations, and reparations can be thought of as a just debt, something that we gladly pay because it contributes to repair. And at Debt Collective, we make a distinguish between those two different types of debt. So unjust debt are debts that we go into for what should be public goods, like housing, healthcare, and education. So thank you so much for mentioning that. Um, and I was also wondering if you could talk about what are some of the misconceptions people have when it comes to climate debt? You said some really important words about the way that liberal folks sometimes talk about climate change and things like that. So, what are some misconceptions and what are the realities that you think people need to understand?
Yeah, so I guess kind of just building on what I said earlier, I think, first of all, a lot of people, especially in the West, don't even really realize how interconnected climate issues and debt actually are. And I think also, like, a lot of people perhaps don't have like a super solid understanding of how debt functions in our international system. And I think our system was built in a way to prevent people from understanding those interconnections and like digging deeper and addressing these root causes. So, yeah, I think climate is oftentimes seen as kind of that safe issue that lives in a vacuum. I think it's oftentimes dehistoricized and depoliticized, but like in reality, it's so enmeshed in how our global system functions. So I think on one level, one misconception is that climate and debt aren't even really related. I think is like an initial misconception that people have. And I think many people perhaps don't realize or understand how debt dictates global relations in addition to how it affects people and communities on the household and municipal levels. And I think this report does very well in delving into all of those different levels of debt and how it all connects back to this issue of climate justice and global capitalism. So, and then I think, furthermore, for people who perhaps have a bit more background on this intersection, I think there's more focus placed on the issue of sovereign debt, um, which is kind of discussed in the intro to the paper and chapter one. And you kind of spoke about this in your introduction as well, where indebted, formerly colonized countries who are contributing the least to climate change are the ones who are experiencing the brunt of these effects and paying the highest costs in many different ways. And I also really appreciate that chapter 1 discusses not only how climate is related to sovereign debt, which I think that connection is a little bit more obvious, but it's also related to household and municipal debt. So I think that is another important misconception that is countered through the work done in this paper, just connecting all of those different levels of debt to this broader issue of climate justice. And I think on top of that, there is a misconception that formerly colonized countries are the debtors, but they are actually the creditors. And I really appreciate that this report focuses on this empowering aspect of debt, and it kind of flips the script so that we can start thinking of ways to um, produce people power and move towards a more just system overall.
That's such an important point. Flipping the script is almost like the entire purpose of the report, and that's what I think makes it such a great teaching tool. I think when it comes to the climate justice movement, it can be really difficult to get the general public involved and interested. We have the science, we have the data, things are looking really bleak, but we also have to give people hope. And we have to give people information that they can actually utilize. And I think that this report does a really excellent job with that. I want to read one part of the introductory report, which really speaks to what you were talking about in terms of municipal debt or personal debt. Because as you mentioned, I think that a lot of people, even in the climate justice movement, might not realize that that's connected to our overall climate crisis. So this excerpt says, just as temperatures hit record highs, so too has total global debt, reaching 315 trillion in the first quarter of 2024. Most of that debt is held by corporations and investors who use the capital to create even more wealth for themselves. But most of the burden falls on those who cannot afford to repay and whose poverty only deepens as a result. Even within the world's wealthiest countries, like the United States, where class, race, and gender inequalities push people underwater, just under one-fifth of the 315 trillion represents household debt, owned by ordinary people, not cities, countries, or corporations. How much of that sum is entangled with the ruinous impact of climate change? The business practices of the fossil fuel industry and the banks, private equity firms, and other major asset managers who fund them have imposed these financial costs on us. And not only our reliance on oil and gas, but also our day-to-day debts, from housing to healthcare, enrich those same corporations and companies and financial institutions. So I think that speaks to exactly what you were talking about, which is one of the most important parts of the overall report. Okay, so the next question I have, this is such a great conversation. Um, so we talked about how climate change isn't just an environmental issue; it's obviously a political and economic issue. As countries in the global south have to absorb the costs of disaster displacement, extraction, and rebuilding. I'm curious, while you're working on the report, what were some of the inspiring organizing tactics that you saw that communities use to fight back? So, what lessons do you think movements around the world can learn from each other right now?
Yeah, and I think the organizing and movements aspect of the report is one of the most special things about it, I think, because it literally provides all of these different examples of how people on the ground are approaching to their local conditions in so many different ways and approaching this broader issue of climate debt. Like according to their means and according to and using all of these sorts of different strategies, and I really appreciate how it's unpacked in this report. But yeah, to answer your question, I think one of the organizations that I was more focused on when I was working on this report was Debt for Climate. They were a very new organization at the time, and I thought it was like very fascinating how it was so expansive even while being such a new organization. So they have chapters in over 30 countries across 5 different continents. And I appreciate that their main goal is making large systems of oppression less abstract through direct action. Um, So that's a quote from them where they specifically call out institutions of global capitalism like the World Bank, the IMF, um, to make those connections very relevant, and, like, a lot less abstract for people, that these are actually the organizations, that are kind of orchestrating this very, subjugating global economy and system, and we should be targeting these organizations and entities. And another organization that I found is super duper inspiring were the Brazil's landless workers movement. I remember watching our interview with them and just being in awe of how much that they have accomplished. So I'm reading from the report. So they say that some of their wins are through 40 years of land occupations, this has led to nearly 400,000 families settling on 8 million hectares of land. Alternative education, farming, and energy provision are also other wins that they've accomplished. And they have an emphasis on food sovereignty, energy sovereignty, environmental sustainability, land reform, and reparations. And one of their tactics is by specifically occupying large estates with violent colonial roots and who have ties to the slave trade in Brazil. So I really appreciate that there are so many connections to this global system on so many different levels. They are so intentional with their tactics and strategies. And overall, they denounce capitalist agriculture. So, like plantation cash crops that are used for export on the global market. And instead, they um, have these non-productive farms producing organic food sovereignty. So I think this is a really great example of a non-reformist reform, which the report also talks about. And I think it is just really great how they are approaching these root issues, because I think the privatization of land is one of the driving factors of capitalism and oppression. So it's literally addressing these root issues in such an impactful way and creating restorative, generative systems in its place. Um, yeah, I think that was definitely one of the organizations that really stood out for me. And I also, of course, have to give a shout out to the Debt Collective and the work it does in really flipping the script on debt. I think that is kind of the whole purpose of the Debt Collective to empower, see debt as not only an issue, but also as a tool of empowerment. So, yeah, just a quote from the Debt Collective. At the Debt Collective, we don't only see household debt as a problem, we also believe that debt's ubiquity is a latent form of collective material power and leverage. Rich people already know this. So the oil baron John Paul Getty said, if you owe the bank $100, the bank owns you. But if you own the bank $100 billion, you own the bank. So I think that just like perfectly exemplifies um, how the debt collective functions, how it flips the script on this, how, yeah, just and the amazing wins that it has accomplished through this approach to debt.
Thank you so much. Thanks for shouting us out. I was definitely going to use that quote as well. I think it's really kind of, our founders of Debt Collective, especially Hannah Appel and Astra Taylor, have taught me so much over the years. And I'm kind of like obsessed with debt. And I think people in my everyday life are kind of just like, why is this such a big issue for you? And I'm like, but you guys don't get it. Like, our debts are rich people's assets, and the rich are robbing us twice. We're having to pay for what should be public goods with interest. I'm just like, this is the issue. And I think a lot of people haven't necessarily caught on yet. And that's why the work that you're doing and the work that I'm doing is so important. So I think that now we're going to transition. I'm really excited to talk a little bit about being an artist, being a movement artist, because not only is Maizah an incredible academic, as you could tell, but also she is an educator as well as a visual artist. And so I'd love to hear more about those two practices and how they might interact between scholarship and art making. Is there something that art allows you to express emotionally, spiritually, that academic writing maybe can't?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is something that I think about a lot because sometimes I feel that those two worlds for me feel kind of disconnected. And I've been trying to work towards bridging art with my academics and scholarship more and more. And I think one of those ways was by incorporating my illustrations into this uh, debt debt collective report, and by just trying to connect with different community organizations and do art for them. So I think in general, I'm very passionate about uplifting typically devalued forms of data and information. So like art, like narratives, like oral histories. I think that I've seen a fetishization of objective numerical data and statistics, which of course has its uses and is very helpful in certain capacities, but I don't think there's any such thing as objective. And I think that um, that this can, like, lead to so many, like, destructive power dynamics by placing so much value on certain types of data and information and knowledge versus others. So I think things like art, oral history, narrative are just as important sources of knowledge and expression. Um, so I think that art specifically has such an ability to reach people. I think that there is such a clear impact of storytelling as a mode of reaching audiences beyond just the academic sphere, which I think is oftentimes inaccessible to a lot of people. And I appreciate that this report does not feel nearly as inaccessible as a lot of academic reports does. I actually think it's very accessible. It relies heavily on graphics, visuals, other modes of explaining information. And I think that, yeah, there's like such an emphasis placed on accessibility, which I really appreciate. So, as you said, I think art is part of the organizing, for example, using art to tell stories and to uplift marginalized voices. I'm just thinking about like a comic that I did as part of an Artists for Immigration Immigrants series, where I worked with a an organization called Acacia Justice, which works with undocumented immigrants. And through that comic, I kind of told the story of a young undocumented girl, um, and yeah, I just told her story through my art, and I think that was very impactful. Um, just using art as a means of storytelling, as a means of inspiring empathy and action. Um, and I also am very interested in art as propaganda and as counter hegemony. Because as I said earlier, I think there is a lot of emphasis placed on certain types of information, certain types of narratives, and I think a big part of the work that we need to do is like winning the information war. So a big part of the battle is by changing minds and raising awareness because I think the information that we are constantly inundated with intentionally upholds these ongoing structures of oppression and writes a narrative that obscures and even denies all these ongoing forms of subjugation. So, for example, I like one very easy example is just looking at how mass media portrays global conflicts and issues like the issue of Palestine. Um, like that is such a clear example there. So yeah, I just said a whole lot of things kind of went all over the place,
No,
but
that was amazing. You did such a superb job of talking about what it's like to be an artist. I agree with you. I think that sometimes there's a siloing between artist communities and academic communities, and I think we need to work in collaboration more often. And I think there is some learning that folks in academia or other, maybe even in organizing and movement spaces, might need to learn a little bit about the artist process, the process of making art, and that it's not always sometimes we even on the left, think of art as a product, as opposed to that it's not just about the end result, but it's also the process of engaging in the artistic practice itself, which involves curiosity, which involves a lot of components that are the antithesis of authoritarianism, of fascism, and right wing extremism. So I wouldn't say like, I say all art is political, but just because someone's an artist doesn't mean they're necessarily political, right? That we need to have that political analysis. We need to be educated. We need to read and research and be really aware. But I think artists oftentimes were just kind of relegated to like just translators or the performance to make the movement fun and engaging. Which, by the way, we really have to make sure the left is fun because nobody wants to be part of a movement that's not fun. It's not always going to be fun, but ultimately it's fun, right? The revolution is sexy and irresistible and fun. We do that as artists too, but I think even on the left, there's sometimes we forget artists are workers. You know, artists are some of, especially if you come from a working class background, some of artists are some of the most disenfranchised communities. You know, the term gig worker comes from the artist community, and actually, shout out Aja Monet, who just put out a visual album. Oh, actually, it's a spoken word album, and she has a music video, and it's called Working Class Musicians. And I really resonate with that as someone, I've done all types of art from comedy to music to performance, but sometimes people are just like, you're really good at speaking to people. Like, this is just a gift that you just innately have. And it's like, no, it's a skill that's taken probably 20 years to develop to be this strong. And so I think that those are some of the things that we can all learn from each other and kind of build so that we can make this movement that's irresistible, especially when it comes to climate justice work. That's just another issue that we should be bringing to the forefront, as well as a free Palestine, right? Because we know that the militarization of you know, our systems are just contributing to the climate disaster while also contributing to the loss of so much life. Okay, so the last question I have for you before we end this conversation, which by the way has been amazing, um, is I was wondering more broadly, what do you think the role of the artist is within movement right now? Especially at a moment when so many people are struggling to imagine alternatives to the systems we're currently living under.
Yeah, I think that the last part that you just said, imagining alternatives, I think is where I really see the role of the artists within social movements. I think that you and I were previously discussing how our brains literally process images differently from how we process words. And I think we've also kind of been talking about this through our conversation, but I think the system is built in a way to prevent us from even imagining alternatives to how things are. Like, I think we see this extremely oppressive global system, which was like so carefully orchestrated to work in a very particular way. We see these webs of debt used as a means of control and of subjugation to sustain the global economy. And it just feels so difficult to imagine an alternative system because everything is just so enmeshed, so deeply entrenched in these systems of capitalism and like imperialism. So I think that that is where art comes in like really putting emphasis on the importance of imagination and imagining alternatives to our current systems. And I think art makes this feel a lot more natural in a way, versus like using academic writing, for instance, as a way of imagining alternatives. I think for me, art feels like a more natural way of expressing those alternatives. And I think as an artist, as I am creating art, I feel very rooted in who I am, in my personal experiences, and what I imagine the future to be. And I think it just like implicitly comes out in my work. So that's like very obscure and perhaps a little out there, but I think that is my personal experience as an artist. But Yeah, I think a lot about how art, how fiction, how other modes of creative expression can be used as a means of reclaiming what's ours, figuring out how to build sustainable movements from the bottom up, and just imagining alternative systems. And I think sometimes we need to see it visualized, like in a piece of art, or experience it in a piece of music before we can really enact it out in the world. So I think that's where I see the impact of art, and of course also as art as political education, as a and as a mode of exposing truth and building towards justice.
Absolutely. I think you're 100% correct in everything that you just said. Actually, I used to kind of understand this intuitively, but I didn't know how to like prove it necessarily. And I did research actually just like learning about marketing because a lot of the time our media and our art is like taken because we live under racial capitalism. It's kind of like robbed of us and used for marketing to sell us products. But if you actually learn, because you want to know your enemy a little bit, right? And I started to research marketing, and they talk about how images are consumed or understood by the human brain 10,000 times faster than written words. So, literally creating a symbol for something or creating an image to convey an idea is going to resonate that much more for human beings. So, there's science behind why your art is so important. Similarly, when it comes to storytelling, human beings understand the world through stories. That's why our ancestors told so many stories. Um, there, especially when it comes to more complex ideas. And so, although narrative is almost looked down upon at times within academic spaces, it's actually one of the most powerful ways that you convey information and you pass it down. Remember, most people, are using narrative and using oral tradition oftentimes to express information, to express history. And so, I think it's really important to for us to always keep that in mind and just to really have a lot of like trust in ourselves as artists to be able to support different types of movements. Because even the Black Panther Party, they had a minister of culture, Emory Douglas, because they understood how important it was going to be to convey, to create that propaganda. So hopefully we can keep making propaganda about from climate debt to climate justice. And now we have also this amazing report to back up our propaganda so that we will be well researched when it comes to conveying this information. So I just want to say thank you again so much, Maizah, for joining us. For those that might be late, this is Maizah Ali, an incredible artist and academic, and part of this incredible research paper we're going to be sharing, From Climate Debt to Climate Justice, Organizing in the Fight for Climate Repair. So please make sure you read it, share it widely. We're going to be sharing Maizah's work next week. And last but not least, I want to shout out that we have a Jubilee School coming up next week with Hannah Appel, who we've been shouting out. And she's incredible. She will be speaking about her organizing work about divesting the university from state violence, her insights into organizing power and collective struggles. These are really, really important. And this conversation will be extremely impactful. So make sure that you sign up for Jubilee School at debtcollective.org/events. Once again, thank you, Maizah. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.